Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be unpacking something pretty special, a letter that's almost 2,000 years old.
Wow.
1 Thessalonians 2, 1 through 20.
Okay.
It may seem like ancient history, but this letter from the Apostle Paul is full of timeless insights about leadership, about resilience, and what it truly means to be connected to something bigger than ourselves.
Yeah. It's amazing how relevant Paul's words still are today.
Really?
He was writing to a community of new Christians in Thessalonica. They were facing some serious challenges.
Oh, wow.
But the themes that he addresses resonate with us even now.
Okay. Well, let's dive right into the first section of this passage.
Okay.
Verses 1 through 12.
Right.
Where Paul launches into this impassioned defense of his ministry. What was going on here? Why was he so concerned with proving his motives?
Well, to understand that, we need to remember the context.
Okay.
Paul had only recently founded the church in Thessalonica and had been forced to leave due to intense opposition.
Wow.
And in his absence, some people were questioning his motives.
Oh, no.
Suggesting he was in it for personal gain or power.
So it's like he's writing this letter with one hand while fending off rumors with the other.
Exactly. And you can really feel that tension in his words. He uses incredibly strong language, almost pleading with the Thessalonians to remember how he lived among them.
Okay.
He reminds them that he didn't come with flattering speech or a cloak of greed.
There's this one line that really jumps out. Verse 5.
Oh, yeah.
For we never came with words of flattery, as you know, nor with a pretext for greed, God is witness. It's like he's laying his whole heart bare, saying, look, you were there, you saw me, you know this isn't true.
Absolutely. And he goes even further, highlighting how he worked night and day to support himself.
Wow.
So as to not to burden them financially.
Really?
This wasn't common practice for teachers and philosophers in that era. They were often supported by wealthy patrons or expected payment for their services.
So by choosing to work with his own hands, Paul was making a powerful statement.
He absolutely was. It was a deliberate rejection of the prevailing cultural norms.
Wow.
He was demonstrating through his actions that his ministry wasn't about personal profit, but about serving God and the Thessalonians selflessly.
And this ties into a theme we see throughout the New Testament, this idea of Christians being radically different, going against the grain of the culture.
Exactly. And for Paul, it wasn't just about being different for the sake of it. It was about living out the gospel in a way that was authentic and believable. He knew that if people doubted his motives, they wouldn't be open to his message.
This is such a great reminder for us today, too.
I know.
It's easy to get caught up in appearances and self-promotion,
Right.
especially in a world where everyone is vying for attention. But Paul's example challenges us to prioritize integrity and authenticity above all else.
Yeah. I agree. It's not just about what we say, but how we live. People can spot a fake a mile away. True leadership, true influence flows from a place of genuineness and a deep desire to serve others.
Well said. Now, in verses 6 through 12, Paul takes his defense even further, comparing himself and his companions to a father, a nurse, and even a worker among his children. What's the significance of these metaphors?
Paul is drawing on imagery that would have been deeply familiar and resonant for the Thessalonians. The father figure represented authority and guidance, while the nursing mother evoked tenderness, care, and nurturing.
Wow.
By using these images, Paul was emphasizing the multifaceted nature of his ministry. It wasn't just about proclaiming the truth. It was about caring for their souls, nurturing their faith, and guiding them towards spiritual maturity.
It's almost as if he's saying, we didn't just drop in and leave. We invested in you. We poured our hearts into you. We genuinely care about you.
Precisely. And that level of commitment and care was evident not only in his words, but in his actions. He wasn't just a distant figure dispensing wisdom from afar. He was deeply involved in their lives, walking alongside them, sharing their joys and sorrows.
This really challenges the image we often have of Paul as this fiery, almost intimidating figure. There's a surprising tenderness and vulnerability here.
Yes, there is. And I think it's important to see that side of him. Paul wasn't just a theological powerhouse. He was a man who loved deeply and sacrificially. He wasn't afraid to express that love, even if it meant opening himself up to criticism or ridicule.
So in these first 12 verses, we see Paul passionately defending his ministry,
Yes.
emphasizing his integrity, his selflessness,
Yeah.
and his deep love for the Thessalonians. It's a powerful reminder that true leadership is rooted in authenticity and a genuine desire to serve others, not to seek personal gain or recognition.
And that's a message that transcends time and culture. It's just as relevant for leaders today as it was for Paul in the early church.
Let's pause here for a moment and shift gears slightly. We've talked about the challenges Paul faced personally, but the Thessalonians themselves were facing some intense opposition. What can you tell us about the context they were living in?
Well, remember, Christianity was still a very new and controversial movement at this time.
Oh, okay.
It was seen as a threat to the established order, both religiously and politically.
Wow.
The Roman Empire, with its pantheon of gods and goddesses, wasn't exactly welcoming to those who claimed that Jesus was the only true God.
So becoming a Christian back then wasn't just a matter of changing your beliefs.
No.
It meant stepping into a whole new way of life.
Yes.
A way of life that could be dangerous.
Exactly. And the Thessalonians were experiencing that firsthand.
Oh, wow.
They were being ostracized,
Oh, no.
persecuted,
Wow.
and even facing violence for their faith.
This really helps us understand the intensity of Paul's words. He wasn't just offering abstract theological concepts. He was writing to people who were living in the trenches, facing real danger, and desperately needing encouragement.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the next section of the passage,
Okay.
verses 13 through 16,
Okay.
where Paul directly addresses the persecution that they're facing. But he does something really interesting here.
Oh, really?
He draws a parallel
Okay.
between the Thessalonians' experience and the suffering of the churches in Judea.
Now, just to clarify for our listeners, the churches in Judea were the earliest Christian communities, the ones closest to Jerusalem where Jesus had lived and died. So why would Paul compare these two groups?
That's a good question.
What's the connection he's making?
By linking the Thessalonian suffering to the experiences of the Judean Christians, Paul is reminding them that they're not alone in their struggles.
Okay.
They're part of a larger story, a global movement that's facing opposition, but ultimately rooted in God's power and purpose.
It's like he's saying, look, you're part of something much bigger than yourselves.
Yes.
You're part of a lineage of faith that goes all the way back to Jesus himself. And just as those early Christians endured persecution, so too can you.
That's a great way to put it. And he doesn't shy away from the harsh realities they're facing.
Okay.
He uses some very strong language to condemn those who are opposing the gospel.
Yeah. There's this one line in verse 15 that's particularly striking. They killed the Lord Jesus and the prophets and drove us out, and displease God and oppose all mankind. It's clear that Paul isn't sugarcoating anything here.
He's not. He's calling out the injustice, the violence, the outright evil that's being directed at those who follow Christ.
And it makes you wonder, does this change our perception of Paul? We often think of him as this gentle, loving shepherd. But here we see a righteous anger,
Yes.
a fierce protectiveness over those he considers his spiritual family.
It certainly adds another dimension to his personality, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It shows us that love and compassion don't preclude speaking truth to power, even when it's uncomfortable or unpopular.
So in this section, we see Paul acknowledging the suffering of the Thessalonians, connecting their experience to the broader persecution faced by the early church, and offering words of both comfort and challenge. He's reminding them that they're part of a larger story,
Yes.
a story of resilience,
Yes.
faithfulness,
Yes.
and ultimately victory.
Exactly. And it's in that context, amidst the challenges and the persecution, that Paul's deep longing to see the Thessalonians takes center stage. And that's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
Sounds good.
Welcome back. We left off talking about how Paul acknowledged the suffering of the Thessalonians and how he connected their experience to the broader persecution faced by the early church. It's just a stark reminder that following Jesus wasn't just about like a personal transformation. It often meant stepping into a life of conflict and resistance.
And in that context, we see Paul's deep longing to be reunited with the Thessalonians. He spends these last few verses of chapter 2 expressing this intense desire to see them again. It's almost as if he's just pouring his heart out on the page.
Yeah, there's a palpable emotional intensity in these final verses.
Okay.
He uses phrases like, we endeavored to come to you, and we long to see you.
Wow.
He even tells them that he's been torn away from them.
Oh, wow.
It's clear that the separation is causing him real pain.
And it's not just a casual, I miss you kind of feeling.
No.
It's this deep, almost agonizing yearning to be with them again. It makes you wonder what was preventing him from returning. Was it simply like the dangers of travel or something more?
Well, Paul gives us a hint in verse 18.
Okay.
For we wanted to come to you, I, Paul, again and again, but Satan hindered us.
Wow.
This introduces a whole new layer to the story.
Yeah.
It suggests that there were spiritual forces at work actively trying to prevent Paul from returning to Thessalonica.
That's fascinating. So it wasn't just physical obstacles or logistical challenges?
Right.
There was like a spiritual battle raging behind the scenes.
Yes.
What can you tell us about the concept of spiritual warfare in the early church?
Well, for the early Christians, spiritual warfare wasn't just a metaphor.
Yeah.
They believed that there were real spiritual forces, both good and evil, that were constantly at work in the world, and they saw their faith as a direct confrontation with those forces.
So it's like they were living in a world where the spiritual and the physical were intertwined.
Exactly.
Where demons and angels were as real as the people around them.
Exactly. And Paul, as an apostle, was on the front lines of that battle.
Wow.
He wasn't just preaching and teaching.
Okay.
He was engaging in spiritual warfare, confronting the forces of darkness that were trying to hinder the spread of the gospel.
That adds a whole new dimension to our understanding of Paul's ministry. It wasn't just about words and ideas.
Right.
It was about power and authority.
Yes.
About confronting evil and advancing God's kingdom. And also helps explain the intensity of his emotions in this passage. He's not just longing to see his friends. He's fighting for their souls.
That's a powerful insight, and it helps us understand why Paul uses such strong language when he describes his affection for the Thessalonians. He calls them his hope, his joy, his crown of rejoicing.
Oh.
These aren't just sentimental expressions.
Okay.
They're declarations of spiritual victory. He sees them as proof that the gospel is powerful enough to overcome even the most intense opposition, both human and spiritual.
That's incredible. So even though he's physically separated from them, he's still deeply connected to them.
Right.
Not just emotionally, but spiritually.
Mm-hmm.
Their faith is his victory.
Yeah.
Their growth is his reward. It's like they're intertwined in this cosmic battle for the souls of humanity.
Exactly. And that connection transcends time and space. It's not limited by physical proximity or even death. It's a spiritual bond that's forged in the fires of faith and refined through shared suffering and perseverance.
This is so much deeper than I ever imagined. It's like we've peeled back the layers of this passage and discovered this hidden world of spiritual warfare and cosmic connections.
Yeah.
It makes me think about my own relationships and the people I consider my spiritual family.
Yeah.
Are we fighting for each other?
Mm-hmm.
Are we encouraging each other's growth?
Yes.
Are we celebrating each other's victories?
Those are great questions to ponder, and I think Paul's example challenges us to view our relationships, especially those within the church, through a more spiritual lens.
Mm-hmm.
They're not just social connections or casual acquaintances.
Okay.
They're bonds forged in the fire of faith.
Wow.
Connections that can withstand the storms of life and even the assaults of the enemy.
This has been incredibly insightful. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. From Paul's impassioned defense of his ministry to the concept of spiritual warfare.
Right.
And the power of spiritual connection.
Exactly.
But there's still so much to unpack in this passage.
Yes, there is. And that's the beauty of Scripture. It's a well that never runs dry. The more we delve into it, the more we discover, the more we're challenged and transformed.
So before we wrap up this part of our exploration, what are some key takeaways you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Well, first, I think it's important to remember that leadership is not about position or power, but about service and sacrifice.
Okay.
Paul's example challenges us to lead with integrity, humility, and a genuine desire to serve others.
And we also see that following Jesus is not always easy.
Right.
It often means stepping into a life of conflict and resistance, both from the world and from spiritual forces that oppose God's kingdom.
But amidst those challenges, we have the assurance that we're not alone.
Yeah.
We're part of a larger story, a global movement that's rooted in God's power and purpose. And we have each other, a spiritual family that's bound together by faith, love, and a shared purpose.
And that connection,
Yes.
that spiritual bond, is something to be cherished and fought for.
Yeah.
It's a source of strength,
Yeah.
encouragement,
Yeah.
and ultimately victory.
Exactly. And on that note, let's take a short break and come back to explore the final verses of this passage and the lasting legacy of Paul's message for us today.
Welcome back to our deep dive into 1 Thessalonians 2. We've been unpacking Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, exploring his defense of his ministry, the challenges they faced, and the spiritual warfare raging behind the scenes. And it's been quite a journey.
It really has, and in these final verses, we see Paul's heart laid bare as he expresses this deep longing to be reunited with the Thessalonians. But it's more than just a physical longing.
Okay.
It's a spiritual yearning to see them grow in their faith and fulfill their calling.
There's this one phrase he uses that's so powerful.
Yeah.
For what is our hope or joy or crown of boasting before our Lord Jesus at his coming? Is it not you? It's almost as if he's saying, you are my legacy. You are the fruit of my labor. You are the evidence that my ministry has made a difference.
Exactly. And it highlights this deep connection that existed between Paul and the Thessalonians. It wasn't just like a teacher-student relationship or a leader-follower dynamic.
Right.
It was a spiritual family bond, forged in the fires of faith and tested by persecution.
And it makes me think about the nature of true discipleship. It's not just about imparting knowledge or skills.
Right.
It's about investing in people, nurturing their growth, and empowering them to become all that God has created them to be.
I agree. And it's a long-term commitment.
Right.
It's not about quick results or instant gratification. It's about patiently walking alongside people, sharing their joys and sorrows, and celebrating their victories as if they were our own.
Paul's example challenges us to think about our own roles as mentors,
Yes.
disciples, and spiritual family members. Are we investing in others the way that Paul invested in the Thessalonians?
That's a great question.
Are we pouring our hearts into people?
Yeah. Those are great questions to ask ourselves, and I think they get to the heart of what it means to live out the gospel in a truly authentic way. It's not just about believing the right things or going to the right meetings. It's about loving people the way Jesus loved us, sacrificially, unconditionally, and persistently.
And it's about recognizing that our lives are intertwined, that we're part of a larger story, a cosmic tapestry woven together by the threads of faith, love, and a shared purpose.
Right.
Just as Paul's hope and joy were bound up in the Thessalonians, so too are we connected to those around us in ways that we may never fully understand.
That's a beautiful way to put it, and I think it brings us back to the core message of this passage.
Okay.
And indeed, the entire letter to the Thessalonians, it's a message of hope, resilience, and the unwavering power of God's love, even in the midst of suffering and persecution.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some final thoughts you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Well, I would encourage everyone listening to read 1 Thessalonians 2 in its entirety and just reflect on Paul's words.
Okay.
Ask yourself, what challenges am I facing in my own life? How can I embody the qualities of leadership that Paul models? Integrity, selflessness, and a genuine desire to serve others. And who are the people in my life that represent my hope, joy, and crown of rejoicing? How can I invest in them more deeply and celebrate their victories as my own?
Those are powerful questions to ponder.
I agree.
And I hope that this deep dive has not only deepened your understanding of this ancient letter, but also inspired you to live out your faith with greater authenticity, courage, and love. Thanks for joining us.